The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we are joined by Tucker Perkins. Tucker Perkins is the president and CEO of the Propane Education and Research Council. Perkins joined PERC in 2015 as Chief Business Development Officer and was promoted to Chief Operating Officer before the council named him President and CEO in 2018. A Virginia Tech graduate in civil engineering, Perkins earned his MBA from the University of Richmond. Perkins is a dynamic and relatable leader who has amplified propane's voice in the national energy conversation as a frequent keynote speaker on energy-related topics. Tucker is also host of the podcast Path to Zero, in which he engages energy thought leaders in provocative discussions regarding energy and the environment in the path to zero carbon emissions. Now let's get into the episode with Tucker. Welcome back for another great episode, Dave, John, and Tucker.
Great to be back.
Can't wait for
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
episode 2 will be just fantastic.
Okay, so here we go again. In our first episode, we talked about some innovations and developments in propane technology, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to expand a bit further because, quite frankly, there was more there than I think we all thought we were going to hear about. So perhaps you could tell us more about, the developments of propane, not just as a carbon reduction tool, but as a alternate energy source.
Yeah, so we really tend to work in all those markets. So thinking about residential, commercial, industrial, utility scale, transportation, off-road, even to a degree marine, and so we were working in all of that. But it ultimately comes down to generally engine-based solutions, and whether that engine is powering, for example, a heat pump, or fuel cells have been something we worked on so much, but we're always working on durability, efficiency, whatever we're doing. And then today, as we'll talk about power generation, it's really kind of fascinating. Power generation results in nothing more than us selecting existing engines with other existing pieces, finding manufacturers that want to really take a lead in that and putting these systems together. So we're really now reaping the benefits of decades of engine work. And we really have achieved something that I didn't think we could achieve a decade ago, and that is diesel efficiency. So we now have modern propane engines that are as thermally efficient as the best-in-class diesel engines. Diesel durability, again, we've been very respectful of that, but yet the emissions profile that is really capable in many cases of approaching near zero. And if we introduce renewable fuels, it can be below zero. So, and I could talk about, technologies that are just coming to the forefront, things like fuel cells, which I believe we'll talk more and more about, both in power generation and in vehicle transportation. But we have elected to start with fuel cells in power generation only because we struggle with them in a mobile environment. So we again, Propane Education and Research Council, you'd think we would be pretty well vested in research, and we are, but we're really satisfied with the technologies now that are the basic building blocks of systems that anyone can use, a homeowner all the way to an industrial, a giant trying to find a way beyond diesel and perhaps beyond dirty electricity.
Yeah.
So, Tucker, in our first episode, I thought we should dig into this a little better for our audience. When you look at the total energy pie, what would propane represent? So when I'm talking about electricity and fossil fuels, what would propane, do you know what percentage it would represent in, let's say, in the United States?
Yeah, and it's fairly consistent whether I'm talking about America, North America, or the world. We're somewhere around 3% of the energy mix. If you think of all the BTUs consumed, we get about 3% of that. And I think, one of the things I need to always regulate in my own mind is we're not going to be the solution, right? We're not diesel fuel. Diesel fuel in America is something on the order of 80 billion gallons a year, right? So But I think where we do have the opportunities to make significant difference is for the customers that can choose our solutions. And I think that's who your listeners are, frankly. They're people who are trying to figure out how to lower their carbon footprint, be kind to their employees, but also be kind to their shareholders and be kind to their communities. And so, I think we are 3%, give or take, of the energy mix in the world. In North America, we're probably a little stronger than that because we're so strong in the production of both propane and natural gas. But where we fit, we have opportunities to cut emissions, depending on what emission, sometimes up to 90%, and to cut cost in many cases in half. And so it's a massive benefit, and one that we rarely talk about. Using propane clears the air, improves your health, maybe helps you attract and retain employees, and cut your cost. And I struggle to find many fuels that can offer that suite of services.
So let's suggest that what you're saying, the audience starts becoming more informed, and that there's a growth opportunity for propane. Do you see a growth opportunity as far as increase in percentage based on all the benefits that you've just conveyed, with the audience being properly informed to get what's your expectation of?
Yeah, and if you will, let me give you my American numbers, only because I kind of have them off the top of my head.
Sure.
But with just a few clicks of the internet, I could give you the world numbers. And I do think it's different. Let me just use American numbers.
Sure.
We actually just finished 2023's numbers, and in America, we sold about 9 billion gallons of propane. Internally 9 billion gallons. That doesn't include what we use to make plastics or maybe what we use in some chemical processes. And that kind of completes that number. So on a great year that's really cold, we maybe have a lot of agricultural demand for crop drying. That number may skew closer to 11 billion. But let's just if we look over the last 10 years, we sell about 10 billion gallons a year. I am clearly on record to our own industry as saying we should grow our base 50% in the next 5 years. And the only reason we do not is because our industry doesn't answer the phone, right? Because the opportunities in those markets I talk about, and at a very high level, transportation, power generation, in concert with the other things we already do well, that if we're not able to achieve a 50% growth, then we haven't done our own country a service, right? Because again, let me just say, by choosing propane over diesel fuel, tomorrow we clear the air, quiet the streets, make our children healthier, and we save money. And so it's those features are too compelling for most companies. Once presented those solutions, they choose it. And so, yeah, I firmly believe that we'll see a 50% growth in the U.S. over the next 5 to 6 years. If I go on a worldwide basis, as we look to developing countries, I'm not too ready to talk about the pace of adoption, but I can look forward to 10 years and I can tell you with absolute confidence, there'll be more clean cooking with propane. There'll be more power generation with propane. There'll be more vehicles operating on propane. And so I kind of expect that kind of market growth, something on the order of 5 to 10% a year, is quite possible.
So that's significant. And so let me ask you a question on the actual production capacity. Let's say the demand's there. Will the propane industry be able to accommodate that incremental supply easily? Or is there significant changes you're going to have to do to ensure that production is made available?
Thanks for the question. And that's an area that, has really plagued me for a long time as we think about growth. And so interesting numbers, though. And again, uniquely American, I think. But the more natural gas we find, the more natural gas liquids we find, of which propane is one. When I started in the business, our production was about 15 billion gallons a year. Today, we're at 28, 29 billion gallons a year, with most projections going to 30, 35 billion gallons a year. So let's just kind of freeze frame on a second at 30 billion. I just told you, over the last 10 years, we've sold about 10 billion gallons. We're making 30 billion gallons. So we could double our domestic demand never even once hint at a problem for supply or even impact pricing, right? I think we are in such an excess supply of propane or LPG, as you know it around the world, that we can double our market and still not even touch a supply concern or, frankly, a pricing rise just from tight demand.
And for our audience, where does this propane, where's the production come from? Is it from the southern U.S. or whereabouts is it coming from?
It's in all of the shale plays. So,
Okay.
A Texan would only be thinking about, the shale plays that so prevalent all through Texas. But, it's in North Dakota, it's in the Marcellus and the eastern Appalachians. And I love to talk about that Marcellus shale play because at least that's closer to the population centers of the mid-Atlantic. But, pretty well distributed. Clearly, Texas has its share, and Texas keeps growing that Permian Basin more and more. And the more natural gas we find, the more natural gas liquids we find. But, we're really happy we're happy with our existing network of transportation facilities where we're finding propane and moving propane. So, look, no secret, hard to build an electric transmission line, equally hard to build a natural gas pipeline or a propane pipeline. And so the fact that our pipelines are in place is a real benefit. The fact that we can move easily by rail and truck is even a better benefit. And so we're quite happy with our supply demand picture and our transportation infrastructure picture.
Last question, and I'm sorry for hogging this. You talked about renewable propane. Can you share with our audience what makes renewable propane?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and one that almost deserves a longer than a 60-second answer. But I'm gonna try to give you the start one, and I'll say first, for me, renewable propane is real. It's legitimate. And I, as a guy who sits there and sees fraudulent science and fraudulent math and questionable claims on a daily basis, we have struggled to make sure we don't greenwash in any way. We despise it as we're trying to foreshadow what's coming. And we want to make sure that we are being I tend to call us a blue collar fuel, and we're not interested in obfuscating the truth. The reason it's renewable propane, we have to kind of go back to maybe what are the different origins, because there's not one feedstock that becomes renewable propane, but we're taking either waste products, used fats, oils, greases that are ready for the landfill, and now we're reclaiming that carbon and turning it into propane. So we're reusing waste products, or as we think about some modern agricultural techniques like camelina plant, where and all the inputs are considered, we're finding crops, in this particular case, non-food, drought tolerant, easily harvested crops that crush and convert easily to propane. Carbon intensity of that product is 7 today, probably headed to 0 as we perfect the process. But what makes it renewable is we're finding either waste products or easily convertible products and converting that carbon. Interestingly, at the end of the transformation, renewable propane and propane are exactly the same. It's not like biodiesel or diesel being two different things. It is exactly the same. And so what's different is where the carbon came from, and in many cases, even the origin. So
I think, and I recognize it's quite complex, but for renewable propane, is there a price differential for renewable propane versus actual propane for the end use customer?
Yeah, and yes, there is. Although what we have found, and this, I know, antitrust lawyers get nervous when you start talking price at all, but let me just be clear. What we have found ourselves, because we're producing today 10, 12 million gallons of renewable propane, and we're selling it every day right now. And what we have found is consumers, when given the choice to use a near zero fuel, will then ask the price. And if the price moves more than 20, 25% from the price of their conventional fuel, they're not nearly as interested, right? And we see that study comes out every day, depending on what industry you're talking about. So what we have realized is consumers do have, there's not price inelasticity. Price is very important. And so as we're thinking about renewable fuels, we have been fastidious, I mean, almost consumed with finding the right feedstocks that transform easily and give us the characteristics, but at the end of the day are affordable. Because to your point, let's just, just for, round numbers, if propane costs them $1 a gallon, the minute we say this renewable product costs them more than $1.25 a gallon, they're not willing to choose it. But if we can stay in that delta, then many, particularly industrial companies, people who want to have a better ESG footprint, want to look better in the eyes of their community or their employees or their shareholders, they'll choose it at that. And so price is very important. And we've worked hard to make sure we stay in balance. In the US, we're very blessed to have the RINs credits, right? The same way. So a producer is paid handsomely to make renewable fuels. And that's how we get to be such a narrow span between conventional fuel and renewable fuel. That doesn't happen in most other parts of the world. In America, we can match two things: the RINs credits to the producer and the low carbon fuel standard to the end user. And if you match those two price mechanisms, then often we can sell renewable propane nearly at parity.
What I like is we are exploring, and it's always interesting when, we're players in the field we are, and you always think you're well informed, and then something like this comes along and you think, yeah, there's more to learn. And I often joke, I like a day when I learn something, and today's one of those. So that's really good. Okay, on to my question. Really, can you discuss some of the challenges and barriers that are facing the propane industry, particularly in its effort to reduce carbon emissions? And how are you, and I guess by that we mean the council, are working to overcome them?
I think, by the way, thank you for that comment. I think, as we talk about the role of low carbon fuels in this energy transformation, it's a conversation that most people don't even have. And of course, we're living, breathing it every day and thinking about real world solutions. So I really appreciate the compliment about education is so important. I think for us, we're doing two things, right? One, we really need to prepare our own industry. And I think that might sound interesting to you, but we're trying to prepare our own industry for the final phase of this transformation. It's a tremendous blessing in many respects. Our industry is in the community, but they're not generally huge utilities. They're generally small, independent people who perhaps their fathers and grandfathers delivered coal, oil, wood, and now, moved into the propane industry. So a big part of our emphasis is preparing our industry to be ready for this transformation, to become knowledgeable in selling these hybrid electric propane systems, selling on-road systems, or working with companies who are trying to clean up their material handling fleet. So big part of our effort is actually just working internally to see that our industry is well prepared for the transformation. It doesn't really help us to do all this work in systems and fuels if our industry is not prepared to execute. But the other part of this is doing what you just said earlier, is helping to educate, at the end of the day, business owners, fleets, to a degree, people like you who are advising those people about some of the applications that propane would fit. And I would say 5 years ago, we didn't have these conversations much. People looked for solutions maybe that involved natural gas. When they realized natural gas wasn't available, they chose electricity. Those days are gone, right? The grid may not be able to support growth. The grid may be too expensive. It may not have the right kind of solutions. And now what we find every day, we're involved in conversations that, to be honest, a decade ago, I would have said, I'll never do that, right? We're involved in powering data centers, powering, medium duty truck fleets across the country, powering locomotives or ships with solutions. And so it's unbelievable. But the succinct answer to your question is informing potential users and preparing our industry to respond to that demand.
So I'm going to dig into a little bit what you just said, and that is, can you share with us what the council, how do you engage your consumers and business to promote the whole idea of using propane as a clean solution. What are you doing? I know you talked about how you got to educate your current distributors, but now how do you get to the marketplace, Tucker? What's the council doing to promote? I know that this is one form of educating, but is there another? What else are you doing to educate people and businesses about propane itself?
Yeah, thank you for that. And so, one of the lovely attributes that being a part of the Propane Education Research Council affords us, at the end of the day, we have a staff of almost 40 people. And we're kind of split into thirds, if you will. One's working in safety and training, one's working in business development and the processes, and the other's working in some version of marketing and information. So how do we how do we learn from our customers? We're boots on the ground, right? We're working this morning. It's still early, but I've already, been involved in intensive agricultural conversations around demonstrations of new technologies around clean food. And we're working with 2 universities, government agency, and the farmers of California. So we're boots on the ground with architects and engineers and builders and HVAC. We're boots on the ground listening to what do they need, what's working, what's not working. We also have a pretty intense communications effort, right? Social media, using influencers, being in trade magazines, and we spend a lot of time telling our story through communications and media. Those are our 2 big areas, and you just have to keep working at it, right? You never know what tweet or what, post is going to resonate, which podcast is going to resonate, what meeting with builders or architects or plumbers is going to resonate. And so we just stay focused and we just stay on it.
Tucker, as a fellow podcaster and the host of the Path to Zero podcast, what are some of the most inspiring stories or success stories you've encountered in the transformation towards zero carbon emissions?
Yes, I think can I start? I know you ask about inspiring. It's a critical word to you, and I am inspired often by our guests. But let me maybe start by saying where I've been most informed, because it's been fascinating to me to have access to just world experts around carbon or meteorology and climate. Things that I think the more you read, the more confused you can become. And so having access to people with varying views, right, about what's the role of carbon, what does the climate science say? I've had multiple people talking about nuclear power. Some blow my mind as they talk about the potential of fusion, right? And lastly, for me to have a really better understanding of something that I couldn't have talked to you intelligently about environmental equity, environmental justice. I couldn't have talked to you intelligently about that until we've had multiple guests, right? Not only the NAACP, I think I've had the father of environmental justice on there. So to be exposed to people with this broad background and help shape our views. Maybe sometimes they're for using low carbon fuels like propane and natural gas. Maybe sometimes they're diametrically opposed, and that's okay with us because we're trying to promote the conversation. To your point about inspiration, I think where I get really excited is I see people and their expertise is coming to the forefront now. Actually, a couple engineers, to John's point, coming out of England, as we think about hybrid powertrains. They were talking 5 years ago about how hybrid powertrains are a part of the solution. Just recently, I met with some technologists who had done something fascinating, right? Stranded methane. And we always think about using those assets to make power. They actually use those assets to make power and use it directly into a data center. So, you begin to see sometimes the economic opportunity, if you will. And we've been talking about using stranded assets to make but now for a data center. So to be exposed to people who are now using this new world in ways that are really unique, it is truly inspirational. And it just, as an engineer, entrepreneur, for me, it's just fascinating to see the potential out there. And by the way, potential that very few people see, right? Sometimes Bill Gates sees it, sometimes a certain scientist sees it, but now the opportunities that are evolving to use clean fuels for new solutions, it's amazing.
Tucker, thanks for an educational episode on innovations and challenges in the propane industry. To end this episode off, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think never stop dreaming, right? Never stop thinking about where a solution that you maybe never thought of is right in front of you. You just have to either learn or ask, and it's out there. But I think, look, one of the things we haven't talked about at all here is, for us, it's not so much about just the role of propane. It's about what are these other competing technologies, how will they evolve? Will fusion actually become something real? How does hydrogen get to where it finally gets, right? What happens with batteries? What I'm crystal clear in my belief is that renewable propane, will be part of the solution for decades and decades to come.
Thanks for that, Tucker. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
My biggest takeaway is echoing a little bit of what's there. And I think it's what's really struck me is, particularly when we're experienced in a field, we tend to have convergent thinking, and we tend to be, we know this works, we'll stick with this. And I was looking at, interesting enough, something the other day where somebody was talking about in a project planning phase, how you need to be divergent thinking and then become convergent when you've looked at it. And I think that opportunity, before you've actually spent a dollar or put a spade in the ground, to actually open your mind to saying, well, what are all the opportunities, rather than, oh, we've just got this fixed set. And to me, I think that's the one thing I've come away with this, because yes, I've known of LPG propane. I've never really worked with it. And I found myself coming away from this and thinking, I think I need to keep an eye on this.
Thanks for that, John. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
I actually think I need to speak to Tucker after this conversation to find out more about distribution propane and renewable propane. We deal with a lot of agriculture sectors across North America, and you wouldn't know this, Tucker, that most of them have diesel backup generation. So it seems to me propane sounds like a possible option to consider, let alone possible generation or co-generation, as you conveyed. So again, I want to be candid. I would say to you initially, when we had this conversation at propane, what is like, really, isn't that Pat? Like, and by the way, I had the same thought process about diesel, but now there's renewable diesel. So, like you said, we are very fortunate to talk to people like you, and it opens our mind about things that we never, ever thought or considered. So I count ourselves lucky to be able to do what we do. I love what we do, but we have an opportunity to help customers by speaking to people like you. So I will follow up with you certainly afterwards to learn how we can help you get the message out to help our customers do what they need to do going forward. So thank you for your input.
Tucker, it's been great having you on. Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you. And I look forward to follow up with all of you. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.